not breed up as well as the heifers on the other high diets, but they actually experience greater embryonic mortality. So the argument for 65 is kind of like, hey, it's one of those easy things we can throw out as extension folks and say it works in most all situations for you. It does have some drawbacks. It has a lot of forgiveness. So if we don't meet that 65% target and we're down around 60%, we're probably still okay. The drawbacks are sometimes we have to put in a lot of feed, whereas some others have alluded, maybe we've created the wrong kind of cow for the environment that she's got to work in for the rest of her life. And then we risk over-conditioning those heifers as well as pasture crash, which I think Dr. Cook will talk about here in a little bit. So Rick and some others said, hey, maybe we should challenge that thinking and think about raising those heifers to a 55% target weight and see if that'll work for us. And this is pretty typical results for that type of situation where we see that heifers that were raised to the lower target weight, fewer of those heifers are cycling at the beginning of the breeding season. But by the time we get to the end of the breeding season, we see no difference in pregnancy rates. And as a result of that, in this particular study, there was $22 less cost per pregnant heifer, not just per heifer, but per pregnant heifer, in these systems. And I think Rick has shown that time and time again, and so has Andy Roberts. And so pretty well that this works under a lot of conditions. One of the keys to this working is that these heifers need to gain weight from the time the breeding season starts until pre-calving, and they need to gain it at a greater rate than heifers that were on the 65%. And if our pasture conditions are good, then that's not usually a problem because they experience a compensatory gain. And so one of the things you need to do is make sure that by the time calving comes along, those heifers are 85 to 90% of their mature weight. And if you're in a year where we've got drought or we've got grass that is hardened off and protein content gone down very rapidly, we may need to do some kind of supplementation of those heifers to make sure that those heifers that were developed at 55% mature weight go ahead and finish out and complete and are productive heifers for the rest of their life. So there were some of us that were worried that this might be a train wreck for a lot of folks, but I think Rick and Andy and some others have convinced us that it's probably not a train wreck if we manage things well and we're aware of the limitations. So obviously, I've already talked to you about that heifers need to gain weight. And the other thing is if we get too far below that 55% target weight, we might run into some production problems of various natures. Now this slide always makes Rick mad because we don't have a lot of information on AI and these 55% target weights. And so in some cases we've seen decreases in AI pregnancy rates to heifers developed at 55%, but in other cases we haven't. And in a lot of the research that's been done, heifers have either been developed at 55 and then have had natural service done to them, or AI and natural service, and they've looked at early calving rate. So I think we really need more information, but I think early information coming out of Rick's lab would say, not a huge worry, but we need to watch. That could be a reason for a limitation. So why the argument? It works. It reduces development costs. We have a situation where we can put some pressure on these heifers to be more fertile at a lower body weight. There's not as much forgiveness. There are some risks, especially with heifers that are straight bred, as opposed to a lot of our crossbred cattle that have a higher level of fertility. So with that, I'll skip over this a little bit, but just to say that you need to think about how that system is going to work for you, maybe with purebred herds or herds of small size. The 65 might be a better choice for a commercial herd out there running on range conditions, trying to be the low-cost producer, then maybe 55 is a better choice for us. But we need to make that decision ourselves. The other thing that's going to be talked about is that nutritional stress, pre- and post-breeding, can have a lot of effect on the ability of those cattle to perform. And then Rick has done a lot of work, and others have done some work that shows that previous grazing experience, having those heifers develop on the same feedstuffs that they're going to see as cows, has a big benefit, we think, in terms of long-term productivity. Kind of to get close to wrapping up, this is a study that Rick's graduate student, Shelley Springman, who's got a poster over here, did a year or so ago, where she looked at heifers that are developed on range with protein supplement, heifers that are developed on corn stalks with soy protein supplement, and then heifers that were developed in dry lots with either a fairly high level of wet corn gluten feed or a moderate level of corn gluten feed. And what she found is that those heifers that were on the range for the corn residue had lower rates of gain, below a pound a day, ended up being about 60% of mature weight, compared to those heifers that were a pound and a half, kind of like we recommended, and 67% of mature weight, and then the dry lots were in between. An interesting thing to note is that when they went into that 14-day MGA program and they all got similar feedstuffs, we saw that those heifers that had been nutritionally restricted probably saw a greater increase in energy level compared to those heifers, and so the gains were similar. And then during the breeding season, what she saw were those gains on those heifers were greater for the heifers that were on range or corn residue, and actually those heifers that were over-conditioned in the dry lot showed a decreased gain, but all those heifers weighed about the same when they got to final preg check. When we look at what happened reproductively to those heifers, then we see that there was some slightly lower rates of puberty in those lower gain heifers, but that wasn't statistically significant because they had some huge variations from year to year. But AI pregnancy rates, final pregnancy rates, very similar across all those treatments or all those systems. But then when they looked at 21-day calving rate, those heifers that were in the dry lot. So that stress of being in the dry lot added to that low energy intake level caused problems for those heifers from the long run. So the take-home message here is, as you design systems for your situation, you need to make sure that you're cognizant that what you might do or changes you might make may have positive or negative effects. I think one of the other take-home messages from these studies, and a lot of the studies that Rick have been doing, is we probably need to think more about developing our heifers on pasture or on range rather than in a dry lot situation if we can. And I think Dr. Cook will talk more about that as well. Finally, kind of to wrap up, what do we do with these cows after they calve? And again, one of our recommendations has been that we need heifers to calve at body condition score 6, that we see greater rebreeding rates in those heifers. So if you're having first calf heifers that are having problems breeding, you need to kind of see where your body condition scores are on those heifers at calving and pay attention to your late gestation nutritional management on those heifers. The other thing is, it kind of brings up both what Galen and Rick said. Are we creating heifers that have to have a body condition score 6 in order to rebreed as 2- and 3-year-old heifers? And so we need to make sure that that isn't the situation. Some work that just came out in New Mexico would say that in well-adapted cattle that were generated from well-adapted dams, we might be able to go to a lower body condition score at calving as 2-year-olds and get along very well. Similar study just showing, or similar table that shows you that in these heifers that are in good body condition at calving, we see a high percentage of those heifers becoming pregnant early in the calving season. So to kind of wrap up, we really want to select those early born replacement heifers, those heifers that came from dams that are well adapted to our environment. We want to monitor that pre-weaning environment and think about that as a management opportunity for us, and a place that we might be able to exert some management control from time to time when conditions warrant. We want to choose a target weight that fits your operation. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that 65 is better than 55. You've got to make that decision for yourself. I think we've got some pretty good data out there. So Rick and I have only told 75% lies instead of 50%. Develop a post-weaning nutritional plan that utilizes the feedstuffs that are available to you and is balanced. Work with your extension professional, work with your consulting nutritionist, come up with a good nutritional plan, and Dr. Arlington will visit with you a little bit more about minerals. And then feed the cow for the environment. Feed that heifer, develop that heifer as much as possible. One of the things that we've done at the research station is we no longer feed grain to heifers unless they're in the growth safe system for feed efficiency trials. And then use the reproductive technologies that we've talked about today, whether it be reproductive tract scores, AI, synchronization, and those other things. And I think you'll be very happy with the system that you come up with for your range for developing heifers. With that, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity of being here today and visiting with you.
Thanks, Dr. Hall. That was great. And we're going to move to our next speaker. We'll keep these speakers moving forward. As the speakers go through, if you have questions, write them down. You should have a note card in front of you. Those will be used in the discussion groups tonight, as well as at the end of this afternoon session, we'll have a chance to answer some of those. So we're pleased to have Dr. Arthington, who is a graduate of the Animal Sciences departments at Purdue and Kansas State University, and has been a member of the University of Florida Animal Sciences faculty since 1998. Currently, Dr. Arthington serves as professor and director of the University of Florida Range Center Research and Education Center in Ona, which has faculty programs focused on productivity and environmental sustainability of range and grazing lands. So we're pleased to have Dr. Arthington here this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here today and visit with you. I got into town yesterday. Cliff Lamb and I came in together. We were graduate students here together. It's my first trip back to Manhattan for 20 years. And Sandra suggested maybe I've reached the limits of my probation period. I could finally come back. But what a joy it's been driving around and seeing the area. I told Cliff he could drop me off here somewhere, and I'd have no idea where it was. So much has changed. It's just a great opportunity to be here. I'm really, really thankful for the committee to invite me to come back and share some of this information with you. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Range Cattle Research and Education Center, where we're at. I don't have a diagram of Florida up here, but starting in the end of the fall, I'll be beginning my 20th year there at the University of Florida. Florida's kind of a unique state for beef cattle production. It's about 1 million mama cows, and a little over 80% of those are south of the I-4 corridor. And that corridor runs from Tampa over to Cape Canaveral. You kind of think where that is in South Florida. It's a tropical, subtropical production system, and it's a very dense area of beef cows. Although Florida only would average about number 11, 12, or 13 in the nation for total number of beef cows, about like Colorado or Iowa. They're number 1 in the U.S. for the number of herds with over 2,500 head of mama cows. And all of those herds, with the exception of 2, maybe 3, are south of that I-4 corridor, so all in that area. Now, it's kind of unique in itself, but what's even more unique is that we don't have a single feedlot down there and no traditional stocker operations. There might be a few small background operations. And so almost all of those calves are born in the late fall, early winter, November, December, January, about that 90-day period. The vast majority will be born. And then they're all trucked out of the state. Most of them weaned right on the truck, right before our tropical season, which is July, August. So right now, we're ending our weaning season. I heard John say that they had about 10 inches of rainfall a year. We have about 60 inches of rainfall a year, but it all comes at that time period. And then, as some of you might know, then we complain about drought. How can we have drought with 60 inches of rain a year? So I always tell people that we live in perpetual drought with frequent flooding. And that's what it continues to be. So in the summertime, we're flooded and we try to have those calves out. But what was an interest to me, because I was able to be introduced and study trace minerals when I was here at Kansas State, is that Florida has a rich history with published research on trace mineral nutrition and grazing beef cattle. We have some really interesting trace mineral imbalances in Florida. I'm going to introduce some of those to you now and introduce others around the country, and you might see how they might fit into your type of production situation. So this is kind of how I divided it up, and I wanted to give you some introduction to macro minerals, but most people, when they think about reproduction, they're interested in trace minerals. So we're going to focus most of our time on that, but I'll give you an introduction there. And then I want to spend some time with antagonists. That's something that I know all of you are familiar with. I want to talk to you about some of the modern problems that we're having with antagonists, particularly focusing on sulfur, and then explain to you a little bit about mineral source. Now, one thing I'm not going to have time with is probably the most important thing. It's a very practical thing. How do you get minerals into your beef cows? So methods of supplementation. Now, I tried to hit that pretty good in my proceedings article. You can read about it there, but I'll also be around the rest of the day at the event tonight. And if you'd like to talk about mineral supplementation, methods to get it into cows, I would like to do that. Because that is the most important practical approach in terms of optimizing and dealing with mineral nutrition in the grazing cow. So, when we think about reproduction, I've tried to take this talk and focus on reproduction because that's the general theme of this conference. Is that in almost every situation, the mineral nutrition, that direct effect of mineral nutrition on reproduction, is almost always secondary to something else. Almost always. The direct effect of a mineral deficiency on reproduction is quite rare. It's almost always secondary to something else. I'm going to try to explain that and introduce that to you as we go along. But we can generally put these into three different categories of how minerals impact all physiological processes, but ultimately reproduction in beef cows, and that's these. Antioxidant capacity. So the trace elements I'm going to introduce to you have very strong antioxidant functions, and I'll explain how that can impact reproduction. And then I'm going to show you some new data, some things that we really started to understand about copper and the direct effects that molybdenum has on reproduction, and probably why there's been quite a bit of confusion about copper and the link to reproduction over a number of years. And then, of course, growth rate, just producing bigger. We think about some of the macro minerals and how those, albeit rare in a lot of improved agricultural practices, they still exist. They generally would contribute to poor growth or vigor. And then ultimately, of course, that would impact reproduction. So the macro minerals that I'm going to talk about are just your major ones. And I want to focus on issues such as the calcium-phosphorus ratio. But a lot of these, like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, they relate very closely with dairy cows, and particularly veterinarians in the crowd when they're talking about milk fever. We don't generally think about milk fever in beef cows, but it is this acid-base balance that causes this response. And so I'll introduce that a little bit. So in the title, we talked about magic and mystery, and there's no magic, but there certainly is some mystery. But one of the things I always try to tell people is that the most basic principle with grazing beef cow herds is this idea of feeding a free choice salt-based mineral and then hoping that the cows eat enough of it to satisfy their needs. So I always hear producers say, John, my cows are eating a lot of mineral. They must be short in something. Or, alternatively, and probably worse, they'll say, John, my cows aren't eating any mineral, so they must be satisfied. They must have all the mineral that they need. Neither of those are true. The cow has no idea what she needs. None at all. She only has the nutritional wisdom to consume salt to meet and exceed her sodium requirement. That's it. So if you ever wondered about that, how many of you know about grass tetany in rapidly growing lush spring pastures? And we relate this to magnesium deficiency, right? But if you took cows that were succumbing to death because of grass tetany and you put magnesium oxide out for them, they would never eat it. They would die before they would eat it. They don't know what they need. They only eat that free choice mineral to satisfy their salt craving, and they'll far exceed that amount. And so, surprisingly, for many years, we use this idea of putting salt in our mineral to encourage intake and to limit intake. And so keep that in mind, and I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time talking about that, but in terms of these methods of supplementation, but that's a really important factor and one I hope that you would understand. So generally, salt intake will increase as the forage moisture content increases. So generally, in the summertime or when we have lush, high moisture forages, cows crave sodium more. They'll eat more salt. And you can also see that with cows that are consuming baleage or silage versus dry hay. They will consume more free choice salt when they consume that higher moisture forage. And then salt intake will often decrease. Voluntary free choice intake will often decrease in the wintertime when you feed an energy and protein supplement. So I'm really on a bandwagon right now with my producers, trying to encourage them to mix their mineral supplement into their winter supplement so that it can be fed at the amount that you want. Don't give that cow an opportunity to decide what she wants to eat.
feed it to her. It's called controlled mineral feeding, and it's something that works quite well. So, calcium, almost all of the calcium in the body is stored in bones. And those of you that remember your basic animal nutrition, it's that ability to remobilize that calcium that is really important for maintaining calcium homeostasis. And so, if you ever have issues related to calcium imbalance, it's generally related to structural problems and generally related to bone issues. And it's something that we don't run into that much. Now, low calcium, or rather this imbalance in calcium and phosphorus, can lead to urinary calculi. And some of you probably have run into that. In my part of the world, it's something that we rarely see. And there are times that you can see where low calcium can cause grass tetany. There are issues related to that. But it's something that I very, very rarely run into. So, maintenance of calcium homeostasis, that is really critical. And I've had some producers and veterinarians and researchers point out that there might be a chance that beef cattle herds suffer, in some cases, to maybe a subclinical milk fever issue because of the amount of milk that some of our beef cows are producing. So to overcome that, it certainly is important that we have calcium and phosphorus balanced well to allow for that remobilization. So if calcium loss exceeds the body to replenish it or remobilize it, that's when you would run into this milk fever issue. Now, when I get into phosphorus, and I only have 2 slides, or maybe 3 on it, I want to talk a little bit more about this. So, of the macro minerals, phosphorus is probably the most important. Probably is. It's certainly the most expensive. So, unless you're feeding a mineral supplement that has a lot of fancy bells and whistles in it, phosphorus is the largest factor contributing to the cost of your mineral supplement. Now, a lot of producers would say for quite some time that I don't really care if I'm feeding too much phosphorus. I want to make sure that they have enough because they remember back when their grandfathers saw enormous responses on rangelands and these perennial grazing pastures when phosphorus was supplemented. These really enormous responses they saw in heifer growth and calf growth. But today, I would tell you that almost all locations, in most locations, overfeed phosphorus. We feed too much. Now, in some parts of the country, that could have some environmental concerns. But for all of us, it has economic concerns. And so I would encourage you to look at the amount of phosphorus that cattle are consuming and look at what you're supplementing. You might be supplementing too much. I'm certainly not saying that it's hurting the animals, but it might be an economic issue. And we feed a lot of byproducts now that we probably didn't feed before that are often high in phosphorus. And so to meet that calcium-phosphorus balance of about 2 to 1, at least 1 to 1 at the very least, we probably have to come in and supplement additional limestone or additional calcium to bring that balance up, just because of the phosphorus content of some of these byproduct feeds. So, of all of the macrominerals, phosphorus is involved in more biological functions than any of the others. And phosphorus, I don't want you to get the idea that it's not important, but it is very important, particularly for proper ruminal function. But in almost all cases with growing forage, or forage that's in its vegetative state, it will almost always deliver enough phosphorus on a dry matter basis. It's very, very seldom that a beef cow would require more than 0.18 or 0.2% phosphorus in the total diet on a dry matter basis, unless she's in early lactation. And it's those times of her life that she may be able to mobilize enough to really get along as well. Now, Lee McDowell always brings this up, and even now when I tell people that cattle do not have a nutritional wisdom to consume anything but salt, okay, to meet their requirement. And he'll tell me they have a nutritional wisdom to consume phosphorus. That is true. But it has to be at extreme phosphorus deficiencies. And this is called pica or pica, depending on who says the word. And it's just a condition where cattle will seek out ashes. Sometimes they'll seek out bones. They'll chew on wood. And they may be suffering from phosphorus deficiency. But I would challenge that that's very, very rare in the United States. And so what I want to tell you is think about this calcium-phosphorus ratio. and the dietary contributions of each. Think about the phosphorus contribution from the byproducts that you're feeding, and try to keep it at least a 1-to-1 ratio. All right? Most nutritionists are already doing that and are recognizing that. Okay. And some cereal grains, by the way, may be very high in calcium, and that'll be an opportunity for you to look at phosphorus. So magnesium. For many of us in the southeast, magnesium's kind of boring because we really don't have that grass tetany issue. But it's second only to potassium in terms of its cation function and that cation-anion balance to buffer the animal's acid balance. Deficiencies very uncommon, except when cattle are grazing those spring high growth situations. All right, and so that's a time when you really want to look at supplementing magnesium, generally in a controlled feeding situation, either through feed or a lick tub, to make sure that you protect against grass tetany. And typically, if forage levels are greater than 0.2% magnesium, which for many of you that is the case, except for that one time of year, additional magnesium isn't important. Potassium also is a strong participant in this cation-anion balance. It is a cation, and we use it a lot to balance against high sulfur. I'm going to show you that in the next couple of slides. But we rarely ever supplement it during the growing season when forage is in its vegetative state. It's really uncommon to see potassium to be deficient. Almost always our range grasses will meet, throughout the United States, meet the potassium requirements of an adult beef cow. It may be inadequate, however, in stored forage, particularly dried forage, or in stockpiled forage. It could be inadequate. If those animals are consuming an energy and protein supplement at that time, which most all of the time they are, then it probably is delivering adequate potassium just from background values. So I wanted to spend a little more time with the last macroelement, and that's sulfur. Now, sulfur is an essential amino acid, or essential mineral, and it's primarily required for the essential sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine and cysteine. All right, but almost always our basal feedstuffs will provide enough to support both the sulfur-containing vitamin functions, as described here, and these amino acid, sulfur-containing amino acid production. So in grazing beef cattle, a deficiency is unlikely. But on the other side, we can be getting large amounts of sulfur in our cattle and be causing problems. Of the antagonists that I'm going to present in a minute, sulfur is by far the most important one for us to consider. So generally, anything over 0.2% sulfur on a dry matter basis in a cow's diet is adequate for any needs that she would have. There are times, many times, that our cows consume more than that, and they may be consuming as much as 0.3 or 0.35 or more % sulfur in the diet. When that happens, we have an antagonistic situation for these trace elements. I want to spend some time talking to you about that. I think it might be one of the most important parts of the information that I want to deliver. So, of the microminerals, the three that are the most important are copper, zinc, and selenium. Now, selenium might not be important to you depending on where you are, and I'll spend a little bit of time introducing that. Now, there are other elements, microelements, particularly manganese and cobalt. They're also important, and they're generally low or deficient in some forages, but they're very easy to supplement. And functions that can be impacted by their deficiency are quite rare in most grazing situations. So whenever I think about zinc, I often tell people, think about rapidly dividing cells. Whatever tissues or organs or physiological functions that would require rapidly dividing cells, that's where you would think of zinc being important. So hoof integrity, skin integrity, spermatogenesis, humoral immune responses to vaccines, responses that require rapidly dividing cells. Zinc is important. And so I'm going to show you a couple slides that relate this to spermatogenesis in bulls. Interestingly, it's the second most abundant trace element found in almost all organisms, second only to iron. So let's talk about spermatogenesis for a minute. Here's some data that I pulled out that we did here in Kansas State quite some time ago, where bulls, developing young bulls, were receiving at that time what was the requirement for growing bulls, I think 30 part per million zinc, or they received zinc from a mixture of organic and inorganic zinc, or they received a high level of inorganic zinc. And then this is just the percent of bulls that were classification deferred. And that meant that they failed their first breeding soundness exam at 12 months of age. That didn't mean that they didn't pass it at an older age. And when we fed the NRC required amount of zinc at 40 part per million, in this case, they had a greater number of bulls that failed compared to the higher level of zinc at 60 part per million. Others have come in and published more recent data showing that bulls that receive organic sources of zinc in this case, they received 450 milligrams a day. That would probably be about 45 part per million, maybe 40 part per million, depending on how much they consumed of the total diet, that they had greater indices of sperm motility when they received the organic form of zinc. So it's not uncommon today to see young growing animals, particularly bulls, being fed a diet that contains higher amounts of zinc or maybe more bioavailable forms of zinc. Now, in terms of selenium and copper, I put these together because they're uniquely important. One is that they cooperate together in the strongest antioxidant function in the body. In your bodies, our cows, or anything. They are the most powerful antioxidant enzymes of all. And so that's probably the point where they really are important. In most parts of the United States, all of our perennial forages are deficient in both selenium and copper. And so that's something that I find them to be unique. And lastly, they are strongly antagonized by sulfur. And so this is also something that's important to keep in mind. So here's the issue. When we have reactive oxygen species, these are those free radicals that you might hear about, they are converted to water by two steps. One step requires copper, and that's superoxide dismutase. That creates hydrogen peroxide. And then the next step requires glutathione peroxidase. That's selenium dependent, and that reduces it to water. This is a very normal biological function that if we are short in either of these, it could result in problems. And then this issue of selenium deficiency in calves. Veterinarians and producers know this as white muscle disease, and that's the clinical form of the disease. But I believe that there's probably more issues related to subclinical selenium deficiency that might be related to this weak calf syndrome. These are calves that just don't have that muscle integrity, that vigor to get up and suckle soon after birth. Could be related to low selenium status in our cows and calves, and also related to this uterine involution issue because of the lack of tissue integrity that these elements would be an important part of. So again, this is that secondary function that I'm talking about that's not necessarily directly related to the lack of that element. I'll show you this slide here because these are some heifers weaned from our cow herd at Florida, and you can see those selenium levels decreasing in what I would consider a well-supplemented cow herd. And that's for two reasons. Number one, milk is a very poor source of selenium, and the calves then only have access to what selenium's in the forage, which is almost devoid. And then lastly, calves don't eat much of that free choice salt-based mineral. You might see them at the feeder, but they're not consuming much. And so we almost always wean calves that are marginally selenium deficient, even in well-managed herds. And this area of research is something that we're really focused on. Now, if you look at where Kansas is here, this is selenium content of the soil. Now, this is interesting because all these other minerals I talked about, every one of them, the plants also have a nutrient requirement for them, right? That's a living organism. They require micronutrients too, macronutrients as well, but they don't require selenium. It's the only one. So plants do what's called luxury accumulation. They will accumulate selenium in luxury amounts without any control because they don't have a requirement for it. All right? So if you live in a state that has high soil selenium, you'll produce plants that are high in selenium. And selenium has a narrow window for toxicity. So that's an issue I think we need to keep in mind. But for many parts of the country, soil selenium is very low. and results in a poor selenium content of the forage. And clearly, the cows that are eating that forage respond. So this is selenium content of ground beef, samples taken from cow plants, processing plants in different parts of the United States. North Dakota, which is known to have selenium accumulating plants due to high soil selenium concentrations, that muscle tissue is high in selenium. You would expect that. And then you move into states that are known to have low soil selenium content, and the meat concentrations are low. So when we think about that then, these deficiencies that result from these micronutrients, we divide them up into two categories: primary deficiency and secondary deficiency. The primary deficiency is simply the result of consuming feedstuffs, forages, supplements that are low in those microminerals or macrominerals. All right? That's not very common. What's more common is the secondary deficiency, where the cow or calf consumes antagonists that tie up the elements of concern and cause a mineral deficiency. It's a secondary route. And that secondary deficiency is something that we're much more interested in. Here are the antagonists that we generally concern ourselves with: sulfur, molybdenum, iron, and aluminum. By far, sulfur is the most important. Now, I want to focus on these two, sulfur and molybdenum, in the next couple slides. Where do you get sulfur from? Here are the sources. High dietary sulfur can come into the diet from forages just due to atmospheric deposition. So rainwater has dilute sulfuric acid in it. You remember acid rain from the 60s and 70s? Well, we still have areas where we have a little bit of dilute sulfuric acid, particularly Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Kentucky. A lot of their forages will be quite high in sulfur from that source. And then sulfur-containing fertilizers can add to it. If you fertilize your grass, you might use ammonium sulfate as a source of nitrogen. Ammonium nitrate used to be more common, but particularly in rural areas, a lot of local fertilizer plants have a hard time inventorying ammonium nitrate because of the liability issues that are related to having ammonium nitrate on hand, as you might know. Ammonium sulfate is a good alternative, but it will contribute sulfur to the forage, and it's something to keep in mind. And then high sulfur supplements and high sulfur water. Now, I want to just tell you another one of the mystery issues. In your water, just because you can smell sulfur doesn't mean the water's high in sulfur. Remember that. And just because you can't smell it doesn't mean it's low in sulfur. When you smell the sulfur, what you're smelling is hydrogen sulfide that's volatilizing off of the surface of the water. And your nose can smell that in parts per trillion, and the total sulfur content might be very low. So I have people tell me all the time, I know my water's high in sulfur, you should smell it. That doesn't mean anything. You need to measure the total sulfur content. Generally, it's the sulfate that contributes to the high sulfur in the water. So here's some examples of high sulfur feedstuffs that many of us use as byproducts for supplementation of our cow herd. Look at these and add all of those sources up to estimate what your cows are consuming. And it's not hard to do. You can do it yourself. County extension agent can help you, or a nutritionist from the university. Add them up. If it comes up to exceed 30 grams per day, that cow will not accumulate copper or selenium in her tissues. She won't do it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. You might go through 3 or 4 months, winter supplementation, she consumes 25 to 35 grams per day, but then you get off of the sulfur and she replenishes herself right away. But keep that in mind as just a rule of thumb. Here's some examples of ammonium sulfate fertilized pastures and the results that can come in pasture forage. 0.5% from 3 years of repeated application. Now, what happens when those cattle consume those high sulfur supplements? Here's an example of cattle consuming liquid molasses. They don't accumulate sulfur or selenium into their tissues, and it can impact performance over a long period of time. Here's an example of copper. Cattle consuming a high sulfur supplement, in this case molasses, and you can see they in the red line, they accumulate no copper in the tissues compared to consuming the same amount of copper through a corn-based supplement. All right? The difference is dramatic. Now, over a short period of time, it probably doesn't matter that much. So, I want to just, I only have about 1.5 minutes, and I want to get into this next point related to sulfur and molybdenum. Many times people have said, copper deficiency leads to reproductive failure. And that has been very inconclusive in the literature. What we know today is it's not the copper, but rather the sulfur and the molybdenum. And what happens is that sulfur and molybdenum combine to form a compound called a thiomolybdate. And you see that on the right side of this slide. And thiomolybdates can be absorbed into the bloodstream and they will bind copper. Now, if you feed copper in the rumen, that will bind the thiomolybdates and cause them not to be absorbed, and they'll be passed out of the animal. So they call it copper-responsive infertility. So it's really the molybdenum and the sulfur that's the problem, but we use the copper to overcome it. Okay? And as this slide here shows you from this Kindle research, the bar clear to your right are thiomolybdates with no additional copper, and it's showing estrogen production from these granulosa cells. And so the last 2 slides or 3 slides I want to show you are just forms of mineral that you have available to you. So inorganic trace minerals are your common sulfate and oxide forms. There's a new form that's available now called hydroxychloride trace minerals. They are also inorganic trace minerals. They differ only in that they have a covalent bond between the metal and the hydroxy group, whereas other inorganic trace minerals are generally ionic bonds. The word organic trace minerals is not a good word. Many of you use the word chelated trace minerals, but organic trace minerals is the broad category of many different forms that are available to us that are simply a combination of the metal bound to a carbon-containing ligand. And so the research has been quite inconclusive. But one thing we do know is that young cattle and stressed cattle tend to respond to organic trace minerals. Mature, healthy cattle do not. And here's some examples of mature cows showing no benefit in pregnancy rates to organic trace minerals, whereas the young cows in their first and second lactation do. Jason Aloha at Colorado State showed the same thing in developing heifers in their first and second lactation, responding very well to organic trace minerals if they were young animals. And so in summary, I introduced to you very quickly macrominerals and microminerals and explained that the microminerals, copper, zinc, and selenium, are those that we need to be the most concerned about. And also, antagonists are very important, particularly sulfur, and that sulfur and molybdenum interaction can be an issue. Those thiomolybdates impact reproduction. It's not copper directly, but rather the direct impact of the thiomolybdates on reproduction. Cattle are consuming high sulfur supplements more so than probably what they used to. There's more sources available to them, and it's something that we should be concerned about. And organic sources of selenium and copper don't appear to overcome the sulfur antagonism. And organic sources of copper, zinc, and manganese have variable results. Generally, I tell people that young, stressed cattle will have a favorable response. Mature, healthy cattle, probably not. With that, I thank you for your attention and your time.
Thanks, Dr. Arthington. Next up, to keep us on schedule, next up we have Dr. Cook, who grew up in a small town surrounded by large citrus, sugarcane, and cow-calf operations in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He received his bachelor's degree from Sao Paulo State University in December 2003 and then moved to the U.S. He is currently at Oregon State University and has been there since 2009. He's an associate professor stationed at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center in Burns. He is the statewide beef cattle specialist and leads an integrated research and extension program with the goal of providing feasible management alternatives to promote and enhance beef cattle production in Oregon and throughout the U.S. Welcome, Dr. Cook.
Thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here one more time, not at Kansas, but at the ARSBC. And today's presentation is going to be a little different than what I did in the past, which was more focused on the temperament aspects of reproduction. I'm going to add a little bit of nutrition and overall stress and how that impacts reproductive efficiency in beef females. So First of all, I mean, we hear the word stress all the time, right? But what does it mean? And if you go online, if you Google it, if you go to Wikipedia, you're going to find a lot of definitions for stress. The one that I like the most, and I think fits well with our discipline, is the sum of reactions that potentially influence the animal's homeostasis. And what's homeostasis? It's a well-being comfort zone, okay? I'm not in my comfort zone here because I'm standing up in front of 300 people. So I'm a little stressed, okay? And that happens every single day of our lives. Stress is part of our lives, and it's part of a cattle production system. So anything that takes me away from my comfort zone, it is classified as a stressor. Now we have three major types of stressors. The physiological stress, let's say disease, when you are sick. When you have any kind of disease, you're not in homeostasis anymore. So it is classified not only a disease, but also as a stressor. Then you have physical stress, let's say injury, or too much exercise. That's also stress. And last but not least, the psychological stressors. One of them is fear. Okay, we're gonna get into that when I go over temperament. And temperament, or excitable temperament, it is a fear response of animals when handled by humans. That's why it's classified as a stress response as well. Now, when we are, and when the animal is away from its comfort zone, the first thing that the body tries to do is bring it back to homeostasis, our comfort zone. Okay. And there's a lot of reactions going on in the body, either behavioral reactions or physiological reactions. And two of them that I like to point out as the sympathetic response and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal response. This is the most complicated word I'm going to use on this presentation today. Okay? From now on, we're going to call it the HPA axis. I'm going to tell you the difference the next slide. But basically, independently of which stressor the animal or you are exposed to, the body tries to bring you back to homeostasis through those two systems. I'm not going to show a diagram of the sympathetic nervous system here because it's basically a nervous pathway, the brain telling the body to produce epinephrine, which is a hormone that we usually have in high concentrations during stress response. It happens very quick. Okay? As soon as you are faced with a challenge that takes you away from your comfort zone, epinephrine goes up. Okay? The second reaction that I want to talk about, which is the HPA response, has more to do with production, agriculture, or animal production, because it is an endocrine response, and it is not as rapid, but it's less longer than the sympathetic response. Okay, so a key example is cortisol. Okay, cortisol is part of the HPA response. When you have a stressor or when the animal is exposed to a stressful situation, cortisol goes up and stays up for a significant period of time, much longer, for instance, than epinephrine. And that high cortisol, it is the main link between stress and decreased productive efficiency in livestock. Now, the main role of those two hormones, either epinephrine or norepinephrine, as well as cortisol and other glucocorticoids, is to restore homeostasis. And a key action of those hormones in the body is to increase nutrient availability by degrading body tissues, for instance, by releasing protein from muscle cells, by releasing fat from adipose tissues, by releasing sugars from body cells. And that can be detrimental to other systems in the body, more specifically the reproductive system, for instance. So this is a diagram. If you Google stress and reproduction, you're going to see a lot of pictures like those, and they're mostly related to heat stress. But like I mentioned before, when the animal is under stress, it doesn't matter if it's a psychological stress, physical stress, which heat stress can be considered a physical stress, or physiological stress, which also can be classified heat stress as. You have not only the intake of the animal is decreased right away. Animals under stress, they don't eat as much as they're supposed to. But then you also have the direct relationship of cortisol with the brain in terms of all the reproductive hormones. So we know that when cortisol is high, the GnRH synthesis, the LH synthesis, the FSH synthesis are all impaired. Even if you give exogenous GnRH, the LH response won't be the same compared to an animal that's not under stress. And with that, you have decreased follicle development, for instance, decreased estrogen synthesis by the follicle. If the follicle is able to ovulate, you have a smaller CL, which produces less progesterone. So overall, you have decreased follicle growth, you have decreased, or perhaps you might have a change in terms of ovulation success, but if the follicle ovulates, its quality won't be the same compared to an animal that's not under stress. And even if that animal is able to conceive, that female is able to conceive, cortisol is the hormone that triggers parturition, right? We all heard about that. So cortisol can actually terminate the pregnancy if the stressor is too extensive. So not only you have impaired ovulation and impaired fertility, you can lose the pregnancy depending on the amount of stress that that animal is exposed to. So we've done a lot of research in this area, trying to connect cortisol and stress with reproductive efficiency in females. We've done research with Bos-Taurus females. We've done similar research with Bos indicus, Bos-Taurus crosses, as well as Bos indicus females, Brahman and Allure cattle in many parts of the world. And every time we make this connection, and this is chance of pregnancy or pregnancy risk compared to blood cortisol concentrations at the time of AI, then we see that the cows with elevated cortisol concentrations, their chance of getting pregnant is half compared to the cows with low cortisol concentrations. So there's a direct connection between cortisol and the chance of that animal to become pregnant and sustain that pregnancy. Overall, the goal of our research program is to come up with strategies to prevent or alleviate stressors, because those are critical for optimal reproductive efficiency in beef operations. And it's important to realize that many of those stressors, they come from routine management, because we do things with our animals that are stressful by nature to them and to us. Okay? Not only we have to understand and also recognize those stressors and the three types of stressors that we have, but also we have to come up with alternatives to prevent or at least mitigate the incidence of stress in our production systems. The first thing that I want to talk about here, and hopefully everybody understood a little bit of where I'm coming from with stress and reproduction, is a topic that Dr. Hall mentioned on his presentation, which is the change of environment and also maintaining heifers on elevated stocking density. On this project, and this is something that I got asked in Oregon by many producers, because during the wintertime, they bring those heifers from the range and they lock them up on small pens or small dry lots for the winter. Many times they see a decreased reproductive performance of those heifers the next breeding season as their first breeding season. So on this project, we had heifers that were raised on pastures or born on pasture, okay, raised on pasture. And then after weaning, they either went to a dry lot system, which is on the right, or they stayed on pasture, okay, after weaning until their next breeding season for about 6 or 7 months. Okay, so in terms of stress that those heifers were exposed to, first of all, the dry lot heifers, they had a sudden change in environment, which is stressful. Now, I want you guys to be honest with me. You guys were sitting on a specific seat before lunch. You guys stood up, grabbed lunch, and how many of you guys came back to the exact same place you were sitting down before lunch? Raise your hands. The vast majority. Because you got used to that place, okay, for a couple hours. You became, that place became your comfort zone. You stood up, had lunch, came back to the exact same place because you knew that seat and you were more comfortable there than actually choosing another seat to sit. Now, the same thing applies on a much bigger proportion on heifers that were used to be on pasture, and then out of the blue they were moved to the dry lot situation. And then what we saw on this project is not only the excessive confinement, because we had those heifers in a pretty small space availability in terms of a stocking density, about 160 square feet per heifers, and the pasture heifers were on 60 acres per heifer. We also had the lack of exercise. Okay, confined heifers, they don't exercise as much as those on pasture, and exercise is important for reproductive development as well. So what we saw in this project was that in terms of growth, it was basically the same from weaning until the beginning of the breeding season. Okay, same diets. You see this picture here. This is at the beginning of the trial. A week later, we had snow, and that snow was there for at least 6 months. So we provided diets to those heifers, fairly similar diets, so gain was about the same. What I want to show here is that the steps per week, which is activity, was much higher on a pasture heifers compared to dry lots, which is expected because they had more area to walk around. Now, this is hair cortisol. And hair cortisol, it is cortisol that we measure in the hair of the animal and gives us a good idea of chronic stress because the cortisol accumulates in the hair. And when you get the first centimeter out of the skin, it gives you an overall idea of the cortisol concentrations in the blood for the last 21 days. Okay? So when you get blood cortisol, you're measuring cortisol at that specific moment. When you do hair cortisol, it gives you an idea of the last 14 to 21 days of cortisol that the heifer or that bull or that cow had. So again, as expected, it was greater on the dry lot heifers compared to the pasture heifers because they were more stressed, not only of the change of environment, but also the confined space and perhaps the lack of exercise. Now, how did that translate to reproduction? This is, remember, body weight gain was the same. Now, heifers on the dry lot systems, they reach puberty much later, if you look at the line here, compared to the heifers on pasture. Okay? The dry lot heifers, they had the weight, they had the body weight, they had the age, but they didn't start puberty. That stress were preventing them from ovulating for the first time and becoming pubertal. From those that reach puberty, okay, from those that reach puberty only, you can see on this small table that the heifers on the dry lot were about 30 days older and 100 pounds heavier than the heifers on pasture on this specific project. Again, we tested extremes and we moved heifers from pasture to the dry lot suddenly after weaning. That's stressful as well. I'm not saying that dry lots, this is what's going to happen. What I'm saying is you have to consider stocking density or stocking rate or space availability to heifers if you're going to be keeping them on dry lot systems. Okay? In terms of observation, this is not something that we published, but for 3 years in a row now, we have a project with the mature cows where we are creep feeding their calves. And during the breeding season, we have to move them to a dry lot facility that we have, not because of the cows, but because of their offspring. That is part of a second trial that we are focusing on. And this is about 300 cows that we have the data so far. And comparing to the cohorts that stayed on pasture, okay, we have the dry lot cows, which was, like I said before, the ones moved to the dry lot system because of a second project that we have going on. Cows in similar body condition score, but look at the preg rates, how it drops when we move those cows to the dry lot 7 days before we start synchronizing them. And they stay there for 30 days after AI. So we get a pretty good hit on preg rates because of the change of environment as well as the confined space, because those heifers or those cows were not used to be on a confined environment. Now, this is something that we did in college, a little trial in terms of human and cattle interaction. And this guy, he wasn't very happy when he saw our design, which was basically having a Jersey cow when he was waking up. And you can tell that doesn't matter what happens, okay? It's not a good idea to wake up and see a Jersey cow right next to you. I wish it was an Allure heifer, and then the response would be different. Okay, now, when you change environments, you also change nutrition. Okay, when you go from a dry lot to a pasture environment or the other way around, you are changing the nutrition most of the time. Even if you provide good nutrition, okay, that change in dietary component is also stressful. It takes some time for the rumen to adapt takes some time for the body to adapt to the new diet. So those changes are perceived by the body as a change in homeostasis. Now, when those animals are lacking in nutrients or inadequate nutrition, not only you have the detrimental effects of poor nutrition and lack of nutrients, but that also is stressful to the animal. So we have some added deleterious effects of poor nutrition and the stress that poor nutrition causes to that specific female. So this is some of George Perry's data that I'm going to share with you guys. And this is something that John Hall also mentioned, which is basically changing the environment of the heifers right after AI. And here he had groups of heifers that were raised on range pastures or dry lot systems, okay? And after AI, they all went to pasture. So basically, the dry lot heifers, they never grazed before. They didn't know how to graze, and they have to learn how to graze. What happened on this project was not only the change in the environment, there was significant stress for heifers going from this scenario, where's the pointer at? This scenario to this, they didn't know how to graze. And what George saw was that even though all heifers were pubertal, again, those heifers, they were moved after AI. On that previous project that I mentioned, they were moved after weaning. So here, most of the heifers were pubertal already, but look at average daily gain after AI. Day 0 is AI. Day 27 is 27 days after AI. Heifers didn't know how to graze, so they barely gained any weight. The heifers that came from dry lots. Okay? The heifers that were raised on pasture, they gained the weight they were supposed to gain. Look at preg rates. Okay? Took a hit. So not only they didn't know how to graze, not only they didn't have enough nutrition to sustain or to be able to successfully become pregnant, also had the stress of changing of environments. So the next slide that I want to talk about is within that post-AI period, we don't want major changes. Okay? I'm going to talk about transportation in a minute, but during those first 30 days after AI, you don't want major changes. Okay? But you have some options that you can use to try and maximize pregnancy success on your females, specifically through targeted nutrition. And this is an area of work that I've done a significant amount of research, and not only with fats that I'm going to talk about, but also with trace minerals. And Dr. Poller, he's been doing some work on that. Specific sugars, amino acids, as well as progestogens, such as MGA, for instance. How to supplement heifers or cows after AI to maximize their chances of becoming pregnant, focusing on pregnancy establishment. Okay? The study I want to talk about, this is an area of work that I've been focusing on the last 8 or 9 years. We've done a lot of work on this with Bos indicas, with Bos indicas crosses, and now with Bos taurus females. And it's just feeding this specific mix of fatty acids, more specifically essential fatty acids, linoleic and linolenic acid, but mostly linoleic, in the form of calcium salts of soybean oil, which is, you have several options in the market, or not several, but a few, and we used one specific brand that we used on the previous projects as well. This is a rumen inert source to avoid extensive modification, okay? Using as a breeding season supplement, for instance. Just a little bit of that specific fatty acid mix, about 100 grams per cow per day, and we mix with corn and soybean meal to facilitate intake. Now, on this last project we just completed, we fed those two diets after AI, beginning, the AI is day 0, and then we fed for 21 days after AI, during that time where the pregnancy is becoming or trying to be established in the body or within the mom's reproductive tract. And again, just 100 grams of this specific product. And then the control diet was 100 grams of palm oil, just to be isocaloric and isonitrogenous. So this specific product, Energy Booster, is all palm oil, so just saturated fat. Okay? And what we saw was that in terms of overall performance was the same between the cows receiving the calcium salts of soybean oil and the control cows. We look at preg rates. Okay? A 9 percentage point increase in preg rates when we supplemented that specific fatty acid mix. To follow up on those results and understand what's going on inside the cow's uterus, because again, we fed after AI. This is not related to ovulation. This is not related to estrus expression. This is related to embryo development, okay, if the embryo is there. So on a follow-up trial that we did in Oregon, and it's John Yeager here somewhere. You probably recognize this picture. And this is Union, Northeast Oregon. On this project, to follow up on the first experiment, we had about 90 cows, and we did the same procedure with those treatments. And day 15 after AI, we flushed the embryos out. Okay, about 60% of the cows, they had an embryo on them. So day 15 is when the embryo starts to tell the mom that he's there, so she doesn't cycle back and the pregnancy is lost. Okay. Then on day 20 after AI, we collected blood for ISGs, which we use. It stands for interferon stimulated genes. And it's basically a measurement that we take to tell us a little bit about embryo establishment success and embryo development. So the more the better, most of the time. What we saw was that from the embryos from the cows that received the specific fatty acid mix, they were producing more interferon tau than the embryos from the control cows. Okay, and the same outcomes we observed on the ISGs. Meaning what? That when you provide those specific fatty acids, and we don't know exactly how much of those fatty acids cows need, humans need, but many women that I know are taking essential fatty acids during early gestation to try to maximize their pregnancy success if they're trying to get pregnant, for instance. We don't know what's causing it, but we know this is positive, and there's something going on inside the cow uterus that's making those embryos to develop a little faster, and those embryos having a better chance of sticking to the cow compared to the control embryos, which explains the increase in preg rates when we provide that supplement to mature beef cows. Now, in terms of nutrition, I just want to make sure that everybody understand that nutrition can also be stressed. Lack of nutrition and even excessive nutrition. Too much nutrition is also driving animals away from their homeostasis. So, if you're looking into body condition score at the beginning of the breeding season, you want to stay away from the extremes. You don't want cows that are extremely thin, and this is chance of pregnancy at the beginning of the breeding season based on body condition score. So as body condition score goes up from 1 to 4, your chance of pregnancy also goes up, but then when you have those excessively fat cows, pregnancy risk goes down. So you want to stay away from those extremely thin and extremely fat cows at the beginning of the breeding season. You want to focus on those kind of in the middle between 5 and 6. Okay. I mentioned a little bit about stress in terms of transport and handling during early gestation or early pregnancy, and this is also a question that I get all the time in Oregon because, the average stocking rate in Oregon, at least in Eastern Oregon, is about 40 acres per cow. 40 acres per cow. So if you have 200-300 cows, you're talking about a 12,000 acre pasture. It takes about 4 days to gather all those cows and bring them to the handling facility to expose them to an estrus synchronization protocol, for instance. It takes a lot of effort. And then you have to take those cows back, respecting each BLM allotment they were assigned to. And many times you do that during early gestation. And that extensive or that extreme exercise or additional handling they're exposed to during early gestation, as we mentioned before, can be detrimental to the pregnancy success. So just a simple table. Okay, some work done in Colorado where cattle were transported right after AI, and then into the truck, and then transported 14 days after AI, which is the period, like I mentioned before, when pregnancy is starting to establish and the embryo telling the mom that he's there. They saw a pretty significant drop, about 8 percentage points in preg rates. On a second study, Dr. Gary, he was looking into something else. He was looking into flunixing megalamine application during early gestation. But what he saw was that handling those animals between day 10 or 15 after AI was detrimental to pregnancy outcomes because you're handling them, you're exposing them to exercise, you're exposing them to running through the chute, to human contact, and even if you do the best job possible in terms of slow stress handling, there's still stress involved. So my advice and the lessons that I learned about this is, if possible, avoid handling, avoid transporting, avoid exposing animals to any unnecessary stress from day 7 to day 21 or even to day 28 after AI, to make sure that you give that embryo and the cow the better chance possible for the pregnancy to be successful. And I know that we're going to have a health section here. I just want to show this one slide about health and reproduction. Remember that not only disease, you have the pathological component to it, but disease is also stress, okay? Also perceived as stress. So what I want to show here is that haptoglobin is a marker of inflammation that we use a lot, okay? It's a marker of disease, but also in healthy animals, you can also have a spike in haptoglobin, for instance, if you expose that animal to stressful situations, or if you provide any specific vaccines, adjuvants, or oil-based products. And if you do that during the breeding season, at the beginning of the breeding season, or early gestation, you have a spike in haptoglobin, you might be hurting pregnancy as well. So anything that you do that causes inflammation, especially during early gestation, can be detrimental to reproductive efficiency. And then the last topic that I want to mention is about temperament. And this is an area of work that I've focused on the last 10, 12 years. Okay? And we've done work with, again, Bos indicus, Taurus crosses, and Bos taurus with females being cows or heifers. And what I want to show here is that temperament, why cows, why do they act the way they act in terms of being aggressive? It's not because they're just naturally mean. It's because they're stressed, okay? Cows that are excitable or aggressive towards humans, they're not comfortable around us. So what they're trying to do is just to run away as fast as they can or run over us to eliminate the threat, right? That's what they're doing. That's their flight or fight response. Because they're afraid. Simple. And fear, it is a psychological stress. So real quick, what we do in terms of classifying heifers or cows for temperament, and this is explained in the proceedings paper, is using chute score x velocity, and then averaging those scores, coming up with a temperament score. And then to facilitate data analysis and interpretation, I usually classify cows with adequate temperament, those with temperament score below 3, and excitable temperament, those with temperament score above 3, on a 1 to 5 scale. Okay? And then our last project that we did with Bos taurus in Oregon, mostly Angus Hereford cows, we saw that, as expected, the cows classified as excitable, they had more cortisol at the beginning of the breeding season. Again, this assessment was on day 0 of the breeding season, which was AI, then 50 days of bull breeding. Cortisol higher on the excitable cows is expected. Look at preg rates, okay? Almost 9 percentage point decrease in preg rates. This is AI and bull breeding. This is final preg rates, okay? If you just look at AI, there is again a 9 percentage point decrease on the excitable cows, okay? Calving weight, about 7 percentage point decrease. What I want to show here is that with that drop in reproductive efficiency, okay, excitable cows are usually good mamas. So if you look at the weaning body weight, it was about the same from calves coming from both types of cows. But the excitable cows, they produce and they wean less calves than the normal cows. At the end of the day, we had a 35-pound drop in terms of calf weaned per cow exposed, in terms of pounds of calf. And based on $1.50 per pound, that's a $52 decrease per cow if you compare cows from the excitable group to the cows from the adequate temperament group. So with that, what to do? Think about temperament. Select your cows for temperament if possible. Okay? Okay, to conclude, I think it's pretty clear, this is common sense, we all know about this, that stress has direct implications on reproduction. It's mainly through cortisol or other hormones that are impacting ovulation and pregnancy physiology. And those outcomes are true for all types of stressors, okay, either from physical, psychological, or physiological nature. Many stressors come from management, and we have to be careful about those and do the best we can to avoid extreme stress. With that, optimize reproductive efficiency in beef operations. So I had 30 minutes, around the money.
Thanks, Dr. Cook. Appreciate that. And before you step out, we're going to have a break in just a second, but we have just a couple announcements before you step out.
Yes, just wanted to clarify some things in regards to the labs tomorrow afternoon. We've made the decision we're going to try and accommodate anybody that wants to come to the lab. However, we will have some preference for those that register early. If you misunderstood that when you came in and want to go to the labs tomorrow afternoon and have not made that arrangement yet, you can do that at the registration desk. We do need you to let us know you're coming because we're ordering box lunches and we need to get a good count there. So if you want to go to the labs and are not currently signed up, check at the registration desk. And I believe there was, our credit card machine had to leave for a little while, and I think it's now back, and somebody was trying to pay for their box lunch and needs to go back now and complete that transaction. Also then, in terms of going out to either the lab or to the Stout Center this evening to eat or for the labs tomorrow, we have those sign-up sheets for you to get a ride. If you need it, you don't have to ride the van to get out there. You can find a friend, but certainly want to make that available for anybody that needs those rides. So if you have any questions about those things, let me know. Our break is set up in the hallway again, and we'll try to get back started at 3:15 to stay on our schedule. Thank you.
Is the Q&A like this morning? Is it for the producer or?
We're going to try and this afternoon, whatever time we have allowed ourselves, we'll have a little quick Q&A, and then we'll take whatever extra questions this evening.
I'll do whatever you say. I was going to go over to the vet school and meet some of my friends from school, but I didn't know if I should be back here by 4:45 for this Q&A. But I will.
If you can make that
No, I will be. I just wanted to make sure that that was it.
We've been good. Have a little bit of time, and I'd like to try and get some Q&A done, and then we can carry on.
All right, perfect. Thank you.